I'm on vacation every single day, cause I love my occupation. Hey, I'm on vacation. If you don't like your life, then you should go and change it. Hey, I'm on vacation every single day, cause I love my occupation. Hey, I'm on vacation every single day, every single day. Every single day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tower of Glass podcast. So today we have a special guest, David Campbell of Sacred Nature Radio, and you can find his episodes at sacrednatureradio.com that will direct to the podcast. And we're back with David. Welcome, David.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And Trent the Wizard. So if you have ever wanted to spend some time with a wizard and a Viking, you came to the right place. And we're very excited to have a guest today. And so I'll just give a brief intro here. So David is running the podcast. His expertise is Chinese herbal medicine and Asian philosophy. And
Actually, a doctor. I'll give a little bit about myself
sure,
as well.
Yeah. Go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, so I have my degree is a doctor in science of Oriental medicine. The sort of area we now call East Asian medicine. And because it includes, Chinese as well as Japanese, Korean, and a few other places that practice this medicine and have contributed to its evolution. And I'm a licensed acupuncturist in the state of Idaho. My, I guess, lifelong interest and pursuit has been trying to figure out how we can reunite science and spirituality, because for me, they're both true. There's something true about each one, or at least each one can be considered a type of pursuit of truth. And what I've always found sort of disappointing in our modern culture, and maybe postmodern or whatever it is that the two are divorced from each other, right? We have like orthodox religion and orthodox institutions of science, and they just try not to get in each other's way too much, right? They stay entirely separated. And for me, that's a dissatisfying answer. Because that to me creates a schizophrenic culture and a schizophrenic person if you try to hold both those things. So from a young age,
I don't mean to interrupt, but I would take that or one step further, even add to that, which is like in terms of spirituality, it's also very orthodox, right? Like people are expected to be in a lane, like, oh, I follow Christianity, or I follow Eastern wisdom, or Taoism or Buddhism, or whatever it is, right? And everybody sort of has their lane and tries to stay in it, which is kind of a funny thing, because to your point, you really can mix and match the best of all things. And let me just share with you too. So the philosophy behind Tower of Glass is that it's all about focusing on what's useful for you as an individual, right? And nobody can tell you what the right path is for you. Only you can determine that for yourself. So the Tower of Glass philosophy is that the glass is always completely full, but its contents are only relatively useful. So it's up to each of us as individuals to determine what is right to put in our glass. Mm-hmm. So I'll pause there and let you continue on that journey.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I began exploring sort of meditative practices and even energy medicine techniques when I was a teenager, and I found them incredible. But I couldn't figure out how we sort of reconcile that with, my other interests. I liked mathematics, I liked science. So what I've come to is the reality is human beings are ignorant, right? Like our glass is only so big. And even if we make the biggest glass possible, 99.999% of the universe doesn't fit in it. So we like to inflate our sense of knowledge, but there's always something hubristic in that. And I think our current sort of civilizational chaos right now is a perfect display of what happens when you think you know everything and try to organize the world based on flawed or say partial understanding of it. And I think, yeah, like I said, I think our civilization has become schizophrenic because there's this people who react by trying to hold on to traditional religion and people who react by trying to push us towards some kind of imagined future, technological, utopia. And I think what's missing is people don't feel like they have real community or real connection to the divine. And so, but I think, that's why there's also a burgeoning, I think, spiritual movement, people looking for real connection as well. But I guess for me, the thing that we can say unites them is really the biggest mysteries are the things that science is trying to investigate, as well as I think when you pursue spirituality, you're also investigating mysteries, maybe more internal versus external, although I think deep in meditation or other practices, people might feel, I don't know if this is all just inside me or not, because there's layers to reality beyond the material. And, something that's hard to understand was hard to understand when I first started learning Chinese medicine, there's a lot of symbols and correlations. So like we have the 5 elements, people usually call them. It's more like the 5 phenomena. It's like the 5 processes in the way the world works. So you have water, which is about resting, consolidating, storing. You have wood, which is about growth associated with the springtime. Fire, summer, maturation, transformation. Then you have earth, which is more about the center, nourishment. And then you have metal, which is the harvest, purification, crystallization, and then back to water. And so that cycle, you could think of it as an oversimplified description of how the world works, but it helps us organize like what the nature of the internal organs are, and therefore what time of day and what time of year we might expect different things to happen with them. And then it helps us understand which herbs growing in nature during which times of year and how that also correlates. And those symbolic correlations, to a modern Western mind seem arbitrary at first. But over time, as you begin to use them more and more, and actually you start to see them in the world, and yes, I would argue it's still just a lens, but it opens you up to understanding things in a way that you wouldn't have been able to without that symbol system. And actually being able to have, useful results in terms of healing. So yeah, that to me it's also how something, like mathematics, like a lot of people will look at, wow, mathematics describes our world so well, maybe we live in a simulation based on mathematics. And I always, to me, it's like, well, don't confuse the language for, the map for the territory kind of a thing. Just because mathematics is a precise language of description doesn't mean that it actually generates the world. I think
I 100% agree with that. There's a point that in studying like the philosophy of number, there's a thing where they talk about mathematics as either incomplete or it's imperfect. So it's incomplete because it goes on for infinity, so it never ends. or if it does, then it's imperfect. And all of the relations that we actually, with mathematics, is the relation between numbers. That's really what mathematics actually means. You know what I mean? That there's this whole kind of paradox that evolves around there. You know what I mean? And that's also why, and Kevin, you know this, there's this book, it's called Beginner's Guide to Constructing the Universe, you know, the mathematical archetypes of nature, art, and science. And that's really one of the things that kind of, you know, blew my mind off the top, you know, with what respect to David is saying. Like, you can't just like rely on mathematics like purely and solely upon its own. And that's kind of where I come up with that fun little thing of like 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, it actually equals infinity. Because when you actually combine two circles together, that gives you the ability to create all the other numbers. So,
Well, in the Tao Te Ching, it literally says the Tao generates the one generates the two by splitting into two different things. The two generate the three. So when they come back together, yin and yang produce qi, which is information. And from that, you get the myriad things or everything.
right.
Yeah. And Taoist philosophy is quite deep. The hard part is it's been translated poorly many times. So I feel very grateful that I was able to learn to translate Chinese myself while I was in school, because there really is a multiplicity of meanings in a lot of Chinese, because each character is like a pictogram. And when you really start to understand the dimensions of that character and then how they're strung together, and, you know, there's good translations. I think my opinion is, if you're going to translate Chinese into English, be as literal as possible. Because anytime you stray from a literal translation, you're now interpreting, which is fine to put in the commentary. But when you represent the text that way, to me, it's unfortunate, because you're giving people a misperception of what's actually there. And that happens a lot. And the boundary between translation and interpretation with Chinese is blurry. So that's the other hard part. But that line is pretty, I think, straightforward. And yeah, so, you know, come back to, like you were saying, 1 + 1. Well, what even is one?
Right.
So this is actually one of the big problems that I realized with mathematics. We don't even know how to define the number one.
Right.
Or the number. So then you go like, okay, well, one is actually a choice. You have to choose what you're counting, right? So you choose a unit in science, like, is it 1 inch or is it 1 micrometer? Is it, you know, 1 ounce or 1 quart or 1 liter, 1 mile? You know, you have to choose what one is, because ultimately it's one universe.
Well, and the sciences, like, they don't use language that actually translates. Like what you're using in chemistry doesn't translate over into biology. This was actually a huge thing in philosophy that Frege, the philosopher Frege, was trying to do. Was he was trying to create logic as like this unified language that all the sciences could use, and he ultimately failed, because there was this 19-year-old kid who came back and said, well, what about the set of all sets? How does the set of all things contain itself?
Yeah.
And so then, like, his project ultimately failed, because he realized, again, to your point, we are the qualifiers. We are the ones choosing and qualifying what that one represents, what that unit of measure is. So,
and so
yeah, so I have one thing to share there. So incidentally, just in the past week, I had my own epiphany. That's part of my journey and my experience, where I now have the capacity to visualize myself living between the zeros and ones. And so, like, just moving around the house, like the way I move now is I am literally visualizing, you know, the bubbles that are possibilities and zeros and ones, and I am literally moving in the space between them and moving them around physically. And it's, so for me, it's a visualization, but it's something that I am able to internalize. And I think that plays in. It's funny that we're having this conversation, because I've just had this experience within the last 7 days, And I made a conscious choice that I'm going to start living between the zeros and ones. And my epiphany was that by being able to visualize that and internalize it, I am then better able to move things around the way I want. Like
Right.
I've got more, I don't know, more author's
Definitely.
license to
Yeah.
manipulate and manifest
Definitely.
for what it's worth.
I think
Well,
this really that kind of perception leads us into something that I would really like David to talk about, because I know that he's written an incredible article and paper about this, but kind of like he said, when you bring the 1 and the 2 back together, you get 3, which is chi, right? That's information.
Yeah.
And he is very knowledgeable on that. If David, you could speak to a little bit about that, kind of speaking to that experience.
Well, it's actually what kind of blows me away is, binary code is what we've decided to translate everything into for this digital era. But the oldest text on binary code is the I Ching. And it's even hard to know exactly how old the I Ching is, because the version we usually look at is the Zhou Yi, which I believe is maybe 2,500 years old, somewhere in that range. But it clearly comes from something quite a bit older. And the legend, well, here you go. I'll take you down some of my weird rabbit holes with this. The legend is that the original writer was Fu Shi. He was red-haired and scaly-skinned, and he married his sister, and he created the first set of 8 trigrams. So trigrams are 3 lines, hexagrams are 6 lines. Most people know the 6-line version. So there's 8 possibilities with 3 lines. And that's because there's 2, each line has 2, right? It can either be solid or broken, yang or yin. And if you organize, the maximum number of combinations then for 3 is 8, because it's 2 to the power of 3 is 8, right? So 2 to the power of 6 is 64. And that's what most people know is the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching, which I Ching means, or some people know it as I Ching. It means the classic of changes, basically, is the best way to think of it. So it's about how things transform. And a lot of people use it as a divination method. You can throw coins or reeds or whatever to get the yin and yang, and you stack them up from the bottom. And then you find, oh, I got this hexagram. Let's read about what this hexagram means. And a lot of that poetry about the hexagrams was written, again, in the Zhou Yi originally, and then there's later versions too that expand on it. But what's amazing is Fu Shi laid out those first trigrams if you read them in order in binary code, you get 765432110. So to me, there's no possibility that he did that accidentally. He actually understood what he was doing, organizing them in that string. He went from 7, counting down to 0, meaning all yang to all yin, all ones to all zeros. That's what it would translate to in binary code. Now, he's also responsible for the magic square, which if you know about like where it's a square, I believe, of 9 digits that all add up to 15, no matter which direction you go. Mm-hmm. Now, so then you go like, well, who's this ancient redheaded, scaly, legendary man in China? Well, so there were some mummies found in the Gobi Desert in China, and turned out they were white-skinned, red-haired, and wearing plaid shawls. So this gets into like, what even is history exactly? Because where did these people come from? Well, I think the scales meant freckles, right? So these are red-haired, freckly people, which are basically somewhere, I think maybe before or a different branch of the same people that ended up in Northern and Western Europe, the Norse and the Gaelic people. But where were they coming from? Likely, in my opinion, they were coming from Egypt, because there's a lot of legends about especially in Scotland and Ireland, about having come from Egypt, and there's been Egyptian artifacts found there.
Hmm.
And then I start looking at it, and like the Gaelic calendar lines up with the Hebrew calendar. They're the only calendars that New Year's in the fall, New Day starts at dusk. And the Gaelic language and the Hebrew language are related. I think both, again, having come through Egypt. So, this is where I start to look at it as like, when people try to go like, oh, this religion is right or that one's right, I'm like, let's look at the bigger story. Let's see where they overlap. And because I look at it as one massive human story, and it may have some interventions with non-humans or non-earthlings. I'm open to that idea, because I think we see things visiting us today. Why would they only be visiting us today and not in the past? And I mean that on every level. That could be the material level, that could be the spiritual level. It's funny. I remember I grew up Catholic, and I remember in the church, the priest would actually say, well, because these descriptions in the Bible don't sound like a lot of things we're used to experiencing, right? And so they would say, well, that was the time of miracles. This isn't, apparently. So to me, it's like, no, you need to reframe the way you see the world. You need to be open to miracles. Once I started exploring things like Reiki, and just, again, I was a teenager and I could feel the shifts happening. And I'm like, well, Jesus was healing people by just laying his hands on, right? I mean, I'm not saying I can heal as well as he did, but I can see how you get, at least start moving in that direction. And it's like, oh, well, Reiki is Japanese, and it sort of comes from Ling Chi in the Chinese, which actually means, Ling is actually one of the most interesting characters. It can mean magic, it can mean efficacious, it can mean numinous. And then Chi, in Japanese is ki. But yeah, so what I actually think here, I'll come back around to what's Chi and what's important about it. So I actually think about it as coherence. So like in this idea of like, what is one versus two? It's, does the thing cohere, right? Or does it decohere? So that happens to us energetically as well. So disease can be thought of as decoherence in the body. So the way we describe it in Chinese is xie qi and jiang qi. Xie, a lot of people translate as evil or noxious. It actually is more literally crooked or out of alignment or out of sync, if you think of it in terms of time. So when you feel something's out of alignment, crooked, not fitting in with the rest of your body, it's not coherent with your system. And that can be on a physical level, it can be on an energetic level, it can be on a totally mental, spiritual level, or emotional level. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, the xie qi needs to be either removed or reintegrated. And that produces jiang qi, which means in alignment, upright, in sync, however you want to think of that. And once that happens, sometimes people will feel a rushing sensation when that first starts flowing again. But ultimately, you don't notice jiang qi. It's when you're feeling good and you don't feel something going on in your body, that's jiang qi. It's in alignment, so there's nothing fighting against anything else. So that's coherence on a quantum level, right? Quantum coherence. People call it entanglement. Entanglement's one particle entangling with another. Coherence is a whole system cohering. So that's what we want in the body, is coherence, harmonious, function. And I like to think about it like metaphors matter. So in conventional medicine, which, by the way, I always tell my patients, sometimes you need the surgery or the drugs. It can save your life. My goal is to help people need as little of that as possible, because there's always side effects. There's always undesired effects, right? But the difference is, conventional medicine, the metaphor is war. Your body is a battlefield. The disease is the enemy. The medication or whatever is a weapon. And collateral damage is expected, right? In holistic health, it's more the an ecological or agricultural metaphor, right? You got to nourish, you got to make sure the soil is healthy, you got to make sure there's enough water, you got to plant seeds, good habits. You got to nourish health over the long term if you ever want a good harvest. And it's not instantaneous, you know? I mean, sometimes, hey, acupuncture needles will release a muscle and people feel a lot better right away. But that's not really long-term health. That's, we got over this speed bump. You know, long-term health is like, are you eating real food? You know, are you drinking enough water that's clean and has enough minerals? You know, and these things get harder and harder every year in our civilization because we keep poisoning everything, making, you know, the food supply gets more toxic every year, the water supply gets more toxic every year. You have to try really hard to get the basics. Are you breathing clean air? Are you breathing enough at all? You know,
Yeah. Are
these
you
foundations, you can't replace them.
No.
But yeah, and then, you know, if there's some injury or disease, then you treat that obviously a little more directly. But yeah, I mean, I'll say this about Chinese herbal medicine specifically. I always feel like an amateur because there's thousands of years of expertise built into the system. I just have to have faith that, you know, and I only recommend herbal treatment when I'm very confident, because I don't like, you know, giving people herbs that may or may not help them. So I do a lot more acupuncture than even herbal recommendations, but there's a lot of supplements I really like, and I often am prescribing probiotics. I would say at least as much as herbs, because people's, man, digestion is, chronic digestive problems are rampant in our culture. And again, I think it's because the food and water, you know, if you don't think about what you're eating or drinking, man, it's really easy to mess up your GI tract.
Completely.
So,
I mean, that's one of the things where, I mean, and Kevin and David obviously knows this, but so I actually met my wife in a water store, and I really learned about the importance of good, clean water. David's wife also was, that's how I know David, is through his wife, and my wife are friends. They were both working at this water store called the Water Brewery, and it was all about clean, energized water. They actually had an acronym for it, which was AMORE, love water, but it was alkaline, mineralized, oxygenated, restructured, and energized water. And not, you know, just drinking water from the tap. People just like say that, you know, but like when you really think about the mechanics and the structure of water and the importance of, kind of like what David's saying, is like giving yourself the quality and nourishment, you know what I mean? It's more of an agricultural metaphor, you know what I mean? Nature is our teacher, and that's how nature works. We are part of nature. And so I think that that's a really important thing. And it really changed my mindset when I really like understood that. It changed the way that I habituate. I mean, even now to this day, I will go and I fill up 5-gallon water jugs of reverse osmosis water. I remineralize it, and I have, you know, positive messages on the outside of what I do, and then it gets vortexed when I actually put it into my glass and drink it. So it's huge.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And one thing I'm reminded of is, you know, in the West, we like to think the universe is constructed, right? We use that metaphor a lot. Like, what are the building blocks? We want to know the particles. I actually don't believe that particles are anything like we think. I think they're standing waves. I think if we want to know what a particle looks like, we should look at a cymatic, you know, a standing wave structure of sound. And what's interesting is there's only certain frequencies that produce clean cymatic structures. And I think that's why energy is quantized, is because there's in between those, it's not harmonic. So there's no structure that it can become stable. So energy will find a stable structure. And so that's why you get this, like this state or that state. You don't get the in between, because it will go through the in between, but it'll do it so quickly because it's not stable there. Anyways, but
We actually talked
the
about
sort of
that.
more Taoist perspective is like the universe grows. It's a living being. It's and the microbiome is huge now because everyone's got some kind of probiotic thing going. But what about the macrobiome, right? Once we realize what biome means, it's like we are in the ecology and the ecology is in us. So that's why I actually have this idea that all acts are selfish. The difference is, what do you identify as self? So if you have a narrow definition of self, that you're just your body, then that's classical selfishness where you're mean to other people to get ahead, right? But if you start expanding that sense of self to include your family, your community, the earth, the air, the water, because you realize actually all of those things are in you and they're cycling in and out of you, and your personal happiness is not going to be there if it's not including your family and your community. And that really actually is affected by all these larger and larger apertures until you get, well, it's the whole planet. Well, actually, it's the whole solar system. Well, actually, it's the whole galaxy. It's like, well, wait, where does self end? It's like the unit problem. And that's what I think, what a spiritual perspective is like, how far can we zoom out and act in accordance with that level of self? It looks selfless. People will call that selfless or altruistic, but it's like, no, because the motivation is still selfish. It's just that you're considering everything a part of self. That's the sort of divine self, the God's eye view. And, none of us are going to stay there permanently unless maybe there are a few people who've done it. but I think that's the way I kind of connect that continuum. And, it's like, yeah, maybe some of these great legendary characters like Jesus, maybe they were able to have that God's eye view and hold it. But for most of us, it's about navigating the in-between. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know where to go from there at this moment.
No, I think that was a fantastic explanation. I mean, we've talked about a lot of this kind of stuff, in the even talking about, we had a whole episode on physics, or we talked about the difference of that solid state of matter, whether it's a point or a wave, do you know what I mean? And like going deep on like the quantumology, like part of the universe. And I think that you explained it beautifully in the sense of, that selfishness is really, what is your perspective and lens? Is it here in this like really small, just like little body, or are you expanding that out to include more stuff, more things, more people, more energy? You know what I mean? So I think that, again, that was really, really well said. I had a question for you, as far as continuing on with that, but it spaced my mind. I got really lost on like you just explaining that and just thinking like, wow.
Well, I'll give an idea that came to mind is there's this idea. So a lot of things are broken up into fives in Chinese medicine theory because of the 5 quote unquote elements. Like I say, I like to call them phenomena because they're more like a process. And so there's the 5 quote unquote Shen, which means spirit. But I would say, so you have in this concept, Jing Qi Shen. So Jing, essence, Qi, energy, information, and Shen is more like spirit or consciousness. But Shen is also used, sometimes translated as divine, or God, which I think God is a weak translation. I'll say it's an interpretation. I would say it's the closest concept we have is Holy Spirit. And holy literally means whole, right? It's the spirit that moves through all things. Yeah. That's also what Shen is like. Shen animates us or gives us consciousness, but it's not just in us. Whereas Qi is more about the organization, the metabolism, the signaling molecules. That's all Qi. But so is the energetic movements in the body, the electromagnetism. And then the Jing is storage. So they say the Jing is stored in the kidneys. But we can think of like when cortisol is dysregulated, people get wired but tired. It's like that's because the jing isn't being stored. It's because the qi needs to go back into storage to become jing. But jing can mean a lot of different things. I think it loosely correlates to our sort of genetic level. But anyways, then there's this idea, well, that there's the 5 shen. So you have water is associated with jur, which basically means the will or willpower. I'll go earth is e, or which is people say mentation or intention. So you can think of it as like the power of the mind, right? And then you have metal, which is po, which they sometimes call, it literally translates as the white spirit, which I call the etheric level. And the reason I call it that is, to me, the etheric level is the level that animates the body, right? So this is the energy of the body. It's not the thing that leaves the body at death. It's the thing that's animating the body. And this po is specifically said to die with the body. Then you have wood is the hun, which is the astral soul, which is the part that can leave the body. So it's our identity in our dreams, as well as in the afterlife. That's the hun. So that's, I would say in the West, we would call it the astral. And then you have the shen, which is the transcendental, and that's associated with fire. So to me, again, I would call that like the Holy Spirit, or, the divine sort of totality. Which, by the way, is a requirement in quantum physics. A lot of people, I like to point this out. Quantum physics, the physicists are very squeamish around this idea that our minds create reality. And for good reason, because that's not really a good description of quantum physics. But they'll admit that conscious observation does seem to have an effect on the manifestation of reality. Well, that's weird. So what's going on there? They said, well, there's probably something like a universal field of consciousness. Oh yeah, you mean the Holy Spirit. Or as Jung called it, the collective unconscious. Or as the Chinese called it, the Shen. It's like when we start realizing, oh, these things are starting to line up. Like,
well, and what I also think is so interesting is the correlation that you find between like the different things. Like, for example, there's 5 Shen. In yoga, there's the 5 bodies, right? That you're supposed to unite. You know what I mean? Like, that number comes up. I mean, the number 5 actually represents, within like esoteric Christianity, it's Christ consciousness. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's something about 5, do you know what I mean, that kind of goes on.
We have 5 digits and we have 5 limbs if you count the head, right? We make, and the 5-pointed star, it gets sometimes demonized as, satanic or something. Again, that's usually when they point it downward. It's the same as if you turn the crossover and point it downward. It's just you're saying that you're against that thing. The 5-pointed star is the symbol of nature. And the reason I'll say that is everything that grows using the golden ratio, right? Because the golden ratio tells you how to create the golden spiral, which is what all fractal structures follow. Our bodies follow that structure. So do plants, so do every animal. That phi ratio. Well, that phi ratio is built into the pentagonal star, the 5-pointed star. If you take different segments of the star and lay them over each other, you get the golden ratio. So to me, it is the symbol of growth in nature, and it organizes the 5 quote unquote elements. Their relationship is organized by that symbol. And so it's a symbol of natural processes, of natural growth, which, is hard. Unfortunately, again, it's been demonized in our culture as associated with something satanic, which what even is satanic? Because ultimately, what I come around to these days is like, well, even the demons work for God. Like, you can't get out of being part of the whole. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, there is good and evil, but there's also like, but the evil is ultimately there to help you progress.
Yeah. When you have light, it produces a shadow.
Yeah. So it's, you gotta, and actually, Are we at the moment to do an exercise?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was going to pull this up here. So I call this emotional integration technique. It was highly influenced by the Sedona method. And I got a couple quotes here from Carl Jung to explain a little bit about why I like this method. So from the philosophical tree, he says, filling the conscious mind with ideal conceptions is a characteristic of Western theosophy, but not the confrontation with the shadow and the world of darkness. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And then from Aeon, he says, the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. For no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge. So again, this relates in my mind to, if you have parts of yourself that are decohering, you need to reintegrate them in order to be coherent. And this is sort of on the emotional level. So my basic instructions are, so it's a series of questions you can ask yourself, ideally in a kind of a meditative state. With each question, wait for each question to be answered by the feelings in your own heart. So don't try to answer it with words, just allow silence because your heart is a sensory organ. It's a very sensitive sensory organ. In fact, it senses things before our eyes. This has been proven. Anyways, the heart rhythm will shift before the eyes notice a change. And we entrain our heart rhythms with other people. But if you can sit by yourself, ask yourself these questions, your heart will answer if you can listen to it. So if feeling with your heart is difficult, consider practicing the following meditation. Say, I am not my mind, I am my heart, over and over silently to yourself until it seems to arise from your heart or the core of your chest rather than your head. So it's interesting, we can actually move our consciousness into different parts of our body, and I would actually even argue beyond our body, but you can actually feel words arising in your heart space rather than in your head space. We're just mostly concerned with our head because that's where our eyes, ears, mouth, everything is. So then here's the questions. There's two versions. I'll start with the simpler one. So again, give yourself maybe 30 seconds after each question to allow an answer to arise. So the first question is, what am I feeling? And then, when will I be willing to feel it fully? And then, can I feel into it more deeply now? And then, when will I be willing to let it go? And would I be willing to let it go now? And yeah, that can be very powerful. The other version of this is if you're not sure, maybe you're not getting an answer, you can try this version, which is, what have I been unwilling to feel? When might I be able to feel it? Could I begin to feel it now? When will I be able to feel it fully? Can I feel into it more deeply now? When will I be willing to let it go? Would I be willing to let it go now? And I have this all written out on my website at wildoakwellness.com. If you go to the blog, this one's called Emotional Integration Technique. So a lot of my blog articles are basically like things like this, where it's, instead of a patient handout, I can just give someone a link. But yeah, and then there's links in here to the Sedona method and trauma release exercise, which if you're interested in working with, your, say, repressed emotions, I think are helpful ways of working with them. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
David, this is amazing. Thank you so much. It's been such a brilliant discussion. It's also very timely. Just by chance, the most recent episode that we recorded for Tao of Glass, um, we went pretty deep on how quantum physics is catching up with spirituality and actually proving quantum physics now is proving metaphysics, which
Yeah.
is awesome. And we did talk about like the double slit experiment, which is it's been dubbed the experiment that broke physics
Yeah.
or broke science, for all the reasons that you already discussed. But I really appreciate you coming on today and sharing your knowledge and wisdom, because it's very timely, and it kind of ties together a lot of the themes that Trent and I have been discussing. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about harmony. Like, how do you live a graceful life and in harmony with within this electromagnetic universe that surrounds us, but is also in us. So you've really tied together a lot of the themes that we've been exploring. So thank you so much for coming on and taking us through this today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Awesome.
David, I really appreciate it, man. Like, David and I have the similar conversations that I have with Kevin. It's just we go deep on this stuff. We start philosophizing and we start riffing on just all kinds of stuff. It seems like, both of our wives actually would just kind of like walk out of the room and like, we'll just let the boys talk. Type thing.
That's funny. And let me tie back to one thing that you said earlier that I think is important, and another message for our listeners, which is expect miracles. Miracles are happening every second of every day.
Yep.
And so that's one of the things that Trent and I are hoping to convey to people is, instead of describing a miracle as something really out of the ordinary, something extraordinary, as a species, I think it's healthy for us to learn how to expect them and how to discuss them openly as though it happens all the time, because it does.
Yeah.
And I think that ties into your healing work. I think that's a huge part of it, is understanding that you can heal, you do heal, you heal all the time without even knowing you're healing. All of these things, again, it's just being in harmony with the universe, and these things happen, and there's the idea that something is really extraordinary is a Western view of that thing. Like, oh, well, that statistically it's less likely, so therefore it must be extraordinary and a miracle that can't be explained. But it's actually quite the opposite. Miracles are happening constantly.
Yeah.
Well,
it's like, once you realize you live in a coherent universe, there's nothing but synchronicity.
Right.
Yes.
Amen.
Anticipate, you know what I mean? And anticipate these things to happen, you know what I mean? And just, I think that that's a huge thing in the sense of like really changing our mindset, is really changing it to an anticipation, to provide that positive outlook, you know what I mean? Like thinking about it in that agricultural sense and not as like a war zone type situation. So
yes. Okay, so and then we normally wrap up our episodes with musical shout outs. So David, do you have one? Do you want to go first?
I'll say my favorite music video of the past several years is by Hailung, their song Narupo. It might be a little confronting for some people, but it feels very deep to me. So the song is about the runes. It's Hailung is a band that's like a Norse. They kind of created sort of their own version of sort of ancient like instruments with bones and skin and wood, and they do these kind of, it feels very ancient, although of course it's not exactly what people were doing hundreds or thousands of years ago, but it feels that way. And that music video is them doing sort of a rune ritual in the forest. And yeah, if you watch that on a big screen with some good speakers, I don't know, it affects you.
Excellent. Trent?
Kevin,
go. Yeah, why don't you go?
I'm gonna go. So I'll be honest. One of the things that just came to my mind is the song "Vacation" by the Dirty Heads. There's a lyric in there that says, "If you don't like your life, then you should go and change it." And so I
Love that
really
song.
so
Yeah, I've even thought about whether that should be like our theme song for our podcast.
hey,
It's a great song.
every day should be a vacation, man.
That's right. All right, and mine today is going to be "Free Will" by Rush. So going back into progressive rock of the '80s. You know, the line that stands out that's really pertinent to our discussions is, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice, and live a life of free will.
Yep. Love it.
There it is. You guys are awesome. I really appreciate this.
Likewise.
Right.
Yeah, I loved it.
Cheers.
Very good. All right. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Yep.
Yeah.
Cheers.